Hello everyone. We're going to continue talking about Chapter 11 on human development. In our last class, we talked about birth through infancy, through childhood, and now we're going to talk about adolescence. Adolescence is a period of development that begins with the onset of sexual maturity and lasts until the beginning of adulthood. We know that this stage is marked and it's different from the transition from infancy to childhood in that it happens so rapidly in comparison. So infancy is birth to about 2 years of age, childhood spans from 2 to 11 years of age, and then from 11 to 14 we're in our adolescence until adulthood. This is because of puberty. This is just bodily changes associated with sexual maturity. So as most of you have already gone through this period in your life, you know that there are development of certain changes such as primary and secondary sex characteristics. Primary sex characteristics include biological changes that are directly associated with reproduction. This is usually reaching menstruation in young girls, as well as organ changes in males. Secondary sex characteristics often include things that are not directly associated with reproduction. This is usually growth of body hair as well as deepening of the voice. We know that hormonal changes alter body composition, and so things like girls being exposed to high levels of estrogen allows their body, their breasts, their hips, etc. to develop at this stage, as well as high levels of testosterone in males. And both genders are also exposed to high levels of androgens, and this is for development of characteristics across both genders. So we previously talked about the neuroscience chapter as well as the memory chapter. We talked about lobes in the brain, their function, as well as changes that are taking place. And so now we're going to talk about things that are definitely changing during this adolescent period. First is rapid growth in the temporal or the language area of the brain, speech comprehension, speech production, as well as the parietal lobe, which are our spatial abilities to orient ourselves in the world, up until about the age of 13. And this tells us that the critical language acquisition period is ending. We talked about Noam Chomsky's language acquisition device, as well as Jeannie Wiley's case study, in which she was isolated for most of her life and could not understand or speak language, even in simple sentences. One of the major changes here that we're concerned with are changes in the prefrontal cortex. This is the front of the brain. We talked about our major executive decisions taking place here. And what we see is that synaptic proliferation from infancy causes synaptic pruning in adolescence. And basically what this means is synaptic proliferation is when we develop more synaptic or neural connections than are needed earlier in life. Since 75% of the brain develops outside of the womb, it allows us to adapt to our environment and to be shaped by our experiences rather than coming out completely developed and unprepared for what we're going to experience. And what happens is we go through synaptic pruning if the pathways that we created earlier in life go unused. We essentially get rid of them so that the pathways that are being used become more efficient and more specific. And so we talked about myelination, the fatty insulated layer on the axon of all of our brain neurons taking place during prenatal development, through infancy, all the way through adulthood, and this is how we become more efficient. Here is a graph or a picture showing growing a grown-up brain. It's got detailed information about gray matter, temporal and parietal lobe, as well as the frontal lobe development. And what you'll see is that from age 5, you see all these red and these green in these yellow areas that are more densely packed gray matter, which is all of those connections. And as you see, the brain becomes less and less dense, the bluish purple color, with just a little bit of red, because these connections have essentially been eliminated and only the ones left are actively being used, and they're very specific and efficient. In early puberty, we know that these cognitive changes are going on, but one of the things that is concerning is that for those who reach puberty or sexual maturity earlier than their peers who reach it at an average or late time, there are psychological consequences, especially for females. And so this includes things such as stress, depression, delinquency, disease for some people. And this is an important thing to consider because we can't really help the rate at which we sexually mature. And so one of the reasons we think this leads to psychological distress is because early bloomers don't have as much time as average to late bloomers to develop skills necessary to cope with adolescence. And also, with the development of characteristics, they tend to look older and are expected to act older as well, which is not always a good thing. The important thing to note here, there's another side of the coin in that boys tend to be better off developing earlier, whereas females really are not, but the speed at which they develop may lead to negative consequences as well. And one of the ways that this can happen is that boys sexually mature at a very fast or rapid rate, but their prefrontal cortex or their frontal lobe isn't developing nearly as fast, and so they can get themselves into situations that they don't know how to handle, but they're still functioning sexually, and this is where we get teen pregnancy. So now we're going to talk about, on that same note, misconceptions about sexual behavior. We know that teen sex is a common interest at this point in our lives, but unfortunately the interest typically surpasses our knowledge of it at this point. And this graph is showing that by age and gender, that parents tend to overestimate the age at which their children are engaging in sexual intercourse. And unfortunately, what this shows us is that if parents ever give the sex talk, it's usually too little too late. In addition to cognitive changes, sexual changes in puberty, we also know that we have social changes or development going on. And one of the first things is that we start to see adolescents shift from the importance of their family and their parents to the importance of their peers. And so we know that peers can exert a considerable influence on a teen's beliefs and actions, and that rejection from their peers can have many negative psychological effects. Now, one of the reasons this might be is because we can choose our peers based on different experiences that we want to have, personality, hobbies, things that we're interested, who we want to be as an adult, but we can't really choose our family. And so what we tend to see is that same-sex cliques start to form during our childhood. We hang out with people of the same gender, and we have similar hobbies. However, as we start to get older, male and female cliques start to meet in public places. You might be going to the movie theater with your friends. And then eventually older members will leave the old clique and form a new, smaller clique, usually with mixed sex members, and they begin to form relationships with each other. And eventually we see people that start dating, and then couples break off and form romantic relationships. And so throughout adolescence, we see that these relationships evolve from each other and start to peel off. One of the good things is that peer pressure is less influential with age, and so these cliques, beyond high school, don't really matter at that point. So another common development in the social area of adolescence is risky behaviors. Peer pressure tends to lead to higher levels of drinking, smoking, engaging in sexual activity, just in general breaking all of the rules, trying to be a rebel, and this is typically because of a lack of education, not knowing any better, as well as cognitive deficits that are impacting behavior. Prefrontal lobe development is not at its peak. Our decisions are not exactly the best at this point in our lives, so yes, that is a cognitive deficit. We also know that these risky behaviors come from the desire for greater autonomy from parents. Kids don't want to be told what to do anymore. Again, they have that rebellious nature because they are developing thoughts and opinions of their own, and they want to be their own person, and they don't want to just follow rules. And so this can lead to risky behavior as well. One theory proposed by Erikson in his Psychosocial stages can help us understand why these changes are taking place. Now, there are 8 different stages that I'll briefly mention, but are in your book. And basically, we have trust versus mistrust, autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt, industry versus inferiority, identity versus role confusion, intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, and finally, ego integrity versus despair. And these are all associated with different periods of the lifespan. And we'll talk about a few examples that really demonstrate this theory. But in general, Erikson proposed this because he said that as we develop into our own person, we are concerned with answering the question about who am I? And we want to develop an adult identity that we're comfortable with and that represents our beliefs and values and opinions in our lives. Here's a graph of what that looks like. As we go from infancy to older adulthood, we progress through these 8 stages and they increase in complexity. So, with the short period of adolescence ending at the age of 14, we have a few more years until we reach adulthood, which is roughly 18 to 21 years of age, all the way up until we die. So, at this point in our lives, we know that our cognitive abilities are at their sharpest in early adulthood. However, we know that our general knowledge remains relatively stable, whereas more specific things, certain types of memories, don't remain as stable. Our abilities and health peak in our 20s as well, but start deteriorating between the ages of 26 and 30 years old. So, unfortunately, between adolescence, developing the prefrontal cortex and really getting a grasp on those abilities, and then reaching adulthood, we don't have a whole lot of time where we're actually in our cognitive peak. So, unfortunately, over time, memory does worsen, but not all types decline at the same rate as I mentioned before. Some of the general declines that do signify older adulthood are greater declines in working memory or manipulating information that is active in our memory versus long-term memory, which is retrieving information, episodic memory, events about our life, and semantic memory, the meaning of words and facts. And it typically happens in that order. Here's a picture graph of semantic versus episodic memory declines from 20, where they're peaking, all the way up through the late 80s. And we see here that semantic memory tends to stay relatively stable and plateaus near the end of life, whereas our episodic memory or memory for past events in our lives tends to decline with age. Also in adulthood, we know that we begin to take on different roles in society, and basically when you get out of college, maybe some of you are planning to get married and become parents, have your own children, and raise your own family. That's fairly common because these are 2 of the most significant aspects of our adult lives. So now I want to talk about taking on those roles, getting married, becoming parents, and how that impacts your psychological well-being, as well as your lifelong happiness. Some of the benefits of marriage include the fact that married people report living longer, tend to be happier, and have better health. However, this tends to change when children come into the picture. Overall, women tend to be less happy when raising children. This is not really a shock because women invest a lot of time and a lot of energy, emotionally and physically, into raising their children, as well as men, but it can be a challenge. Additionally, when people decide to have more children, this often means that they're not as happy and are actually less satisfied. Here's a graph from your book called Till Death Do Us Part. This is showing the difference between the impact of marriage, being widowed, being never married or divorced on men and women. And what we see is that on average, married men and women tend to survive the longest. However, we see differences here where widowed men don't survive as long as a widowed woman might. And actually, divorce and never being married is more detrimental to a woman than being widowed than it is for a man, which is interesting to see these different trends. So we're going to talk about marital satisfaction across the lifespan. And if you keep in mind what you know about getting married and the effects on happiness versus getting married and having kids, we know that satisfaction tends to be highest before kids are born and highest after they leave the house. This is, again, because raising children can be challenging, but most people find it rewarding when they aren't in the middle of doing it. And you see the dip where their children hit adolescence become very difficult. This is where you're wanting to be your own person, and this makes plenty of sense because you too have goals to be married, to have your own children, and you're going to go through the same general trend. Now, as students who are in college, who have left the nest, your parents are probably calling you 5 times a day, wanting to know what you're doing, how things are going, probably nagging you a little bit, but I'm sure many of you get care packages and you get very special treatment from your parents now that you've left the house, because as much of a pain as you were to raise, they really do care about you and they want to be a part of your adult life as well. In addition to taking on those roles of being married and having your own children, we also have a shift in our goals. As we get older, the socio-emotional selectivity states that we tend to focus our energy on information and experiences that bring emotional satisfaction to us in the present. Now, I have the question, what do most people do when they retire? Well, hopefully, after getting an education, graduating, getting a job, maintaining that job, maybe getting married, building a family, raising their own children, you would hope that they would want to do things that make them happy so that they can reap all of the benefits of working hard their entire life. Now, most commonly, at this stage, we pursue social interactions that provide close, rewarding relationships rather than taking risks in new relationships. Unlike adolescence, where we move from close family and parents to hanging out more with our peers, we tend to do the opposite in older adulthood. We're not as concerned with making new acquaintances and hanging out with all of the friends that we've made throughout our lives, but we scale it back and we're more concerned about spending the time that we have left with our family, with our own parents, with our spouse, our kids, our grandkids, and so on. And this leads me to the last thing that I want to talk about, happiness across the lifespan. As we start to change our expectations and our goals, we tend to see that happiness is relatively stable across the lifespan because of this. So positive affect and negative affect, or negative emotions tend to become less significant later in life because older adults don't have a lot of time to be worrying about things that they can't control and that may not get better. And so older adults tend to focus on the more positive aspects of life, what they do have, what they have experienced, as well as focusing on what's going to make them happy in their last days. And interestingly enough, we see that older adults are actually better at regulating their emotions, and they do notice more positive emotions than, say, younger adults in adolescence or even childhood. So, hopefully that gives you a pretty good grasp of how things are continuous, how things change across the lifespan from this chapter. That wraps it up. See everyone in class on Tuesday.